They say curiosity killed the cat. In these 8 films, curiosity will destroy your mind. We aren't talking about generic jump scares. We are talking about cursed frequencies, forbidden broadcasts, and lost footage that permanently rewrites reality the second you look at it. Today, we'll look at 8 horror movies with concepts so deeply unsettling, you'll wish you had never hit play. Some movies don't just disturb you, they crawl under your skin and stay there. These 8 films were made to unsettle you, and they do exactly that. You have been warned. Censor. Prano Bailey Bond's 2021 British psychological horror drops us into 1985 England, right in the middle of the video nasty panic, where a wave of brutal underground films is flooding the country on VHS. Enid Baines works as a film censor for the British Board of Film Classification, and her colleagues call her Little Miss Perfect because of how strictly she recommends cuts and outright bans on violent content. Enid carries a quiet but constant weight. Her younger sister Nina disappeared when they were children, and while her parents have had Nina legally declared dead, Enid has never accepted it. Her days are spent watching atrocities on screen and deciding what the public is allowed to see, a job she treats with total seriousness. When a man murders his wife and children, and a tabloid newspaper links the killing to a film Enid approved months earlier, threatening phone calls begin flooding in, and the pressure on her starts to crack. A producer named Doug Smart approaches her and arranges for her to screen a banned film by reclusive director Frederick North called Don't Go in the Church, and what Enid sees inside that film begins to fracture everything. The footage triggers her memories of Nina's disappearance, and when Enid tracks down another North film, she becomes convinced that the lead actress Alice Lee is actually her missing sister trapped inside the exploitation film industry. Enid visits Smart to find North's address, and when he becomes aggressive toward her, he trips and is impaled on a film award and dies. Enid steals North's address from her workplace, arrives on his film set, kills an actor named Charles with an axe, and then decapitates North himself. Alice, terrified, flees as Enid begs her to be Nina. The film ends with the camera pulling back to reveal the entire story was playing on a television, and a VHS tape labeled Censor slides out of a VCR, because when reality completely dissolves, even the horror you are watching might just be someone else's nightmare on a tape you should never have hit play. Broadcast signal intrusion. Jacob Gentry's 2021 psychological horror thriller is set in Chicago in 1999, where a video archivist named James spends his nights alone digitizing decades of old broadcast tapes at a local television station. James is still deep in grief over the mysterious disappearance of his wife Hannah 3 years earlier, attending therapy sessions by day and burying himself in tape after tape by night. One evening while reviewing archival footage, he stumbles across something that should not be there. A pirate signal intrusion cutting into regular programming, showing a figure in a distorted white rubber mask speaking in garbled, unintelligible audio inside what appears to be a stage set. James begins researching and discovers that similar intrusions occurred in the late 1980s and early 1990s, all unsolved, and that each one coincided with the disappearance of a woman. One of those missing women bears a resemblance to Hannah. A former FCC investigator named Dr. Stuart Lithgow dismisses James entirely, telling him the case was abandoned and that grief can make a person see connections that are not there. James refuses to stop. He connects with a researcher named Alice, who helps him decode Morse code embedded in the tapes, which leads them to a phone number and eventually to a storage unit. His paranoia deepens, and hallucinations of masked figures begin appearing at the edges of his reality. Alice vanishes without explanation, leaving James completely isolated. A third tape surfaces labeled Hannah Ballet 96, and James tracks its origin to an abandoned farmhouse. Inside, he finds a man named Michael Gardner, who has a mark on his hand matching one visible in the third tape, along with the mask and set props from the broadcast stored in a shed. James restrains Michael, forces him to rebuild the original hijack set, puts the mask on him, and demands a confession. Whether Michael is truly responsible, the film never confirms. James kills him. Driving away, the car radio fills with broadcast interference, and James hits something in the road. He gets out and finds a figure with an artificial robotic face leaking black liquid. And the film ends there, without resolution, without Hannah, and without a single signal of truth he can hold on to. Berberian Sound Studio. Peter Strickland's 2012 British psychological horror is set in a 1970s Italian film studio where a meek and mild British sound engineer named Gilderoy arrives at the Berberian sound studio believing he has been hired to work on a film about horses. He quickly discovers the film is actually a giallo horror called The Equestrian Vortex, a blood-soaked occult thriller about riding academy students encountering the vengeful spirits of tortured medieval witches. Gilderoy is deeply uncomfortable but begins work regardless, immediately asking the studio's cold and dismissive receptionist Elena to reimburse his travel expenses, a request that will go nowhere for the entire film. His days are spent in a dim, airless booth doing Foley work, stabbing cabbages and smashing watermelons into microphones to create the sound of bodies being torn apart on screen. He never sees the footage directly, only hears it, while women in the recording booth scream takes for the gory torture sequences over and over. The studio's producer Francesco is dismissive and rude. The director Santini is arrogant and flat out refuses to acknowledge they are making a horror film. A voiceover artist named Sylvia reveals she was molested by Santini, then storms out destroying large portions of their completed work. When the accounts department informs Gilderoy that no record exists of the flight from Heathrow that brought him to Italy, the ground under him quietly disappears. A new actress named Elisa is brought in to replace Sylvia. When her screams are considered inadequate, Francesco urges Gilderoy to distort the sound in her headphones to cause her physical pain and force a better performance. From here, the film peels apart completely. Gilderoy begins speaking Italian, reliving scenes he already experienced as though watching himself from the outside, and the letters from his mother back home begin mirroring the dialogue being recorded around him. During a power cut, Gilderoy switches on the movie projector and an incandescent light fills the screen, and then absorbs him entirely before the film cuts to black, because some studios do not just record horror, they become it. VHS 94, The Empty Wake. Simon Barrett wrote and directed this segment inside the 2021 found footage anthology VHS 94, and it is built entirely around one of the oldest and simplest horror premises imaginable, being alone in a room with a corpse that will not stay dead. Haley is a new employee at Jensen Funeral Home who is assigned by her boss Ronald to host an overnight wake for a recently deceased man named Andrew Edwards. Ronald and his colleague Tim leave for the night as a severe thunderstorm rolls in outside, leaving Haley completely alone with the casket. She passes time reading and making phone calls, but strange knocking sounds keep coming from inside the coffin. She calls Tim, who dismisses it as the body releasing gases. Only one visitor arrives all night, a man named Gustav, who speaks briefly in an unknown language, pays his respects, and immediately leaves. Haley calls her friend Sharon and asks her to look up Andrew in the local obituaries. Sharon calls back with what she finds. Andrew had climbed to the roof of a church and shouted gibberish for an extended period before jumping to his death in front of a congregation. The power cuts out completely. The casket violently jerks in Haley's direction. She tries to flee, but discovers the front doors are chained shut from the outside. When she returns to the viewing room, the casket has tipped over and is empty. Andrew's reanimated corpse is standing against the wall, but the top portion of his skull is missing from the fall, leaving him unable to see. Parts of his body begin separating and falling off as he moves. Haley hides behind the casket and discovers the severed top of Andrew's head on the floor. Still functional, its eyes locking directly onto her and directing the rest of his corpse toward her. She uses room music to briefly mask her movements, but Andrew closes in. The storm escalates into a tornado and strikes the building. When the footage resumes, Haley rises from the wreckage, crawls through a broken window, and disappears into the darkness, possessed and never looking back. Rent-A-Pal. John Stevenson's 2020 psychological horror is set in Denver, Colorado in 1990, where a 40-year-old man named David lives at home caring full-time for his elderly mother, Lucille, who suffers from dementia. David's father, Frank, a jazz musician, died by suicide a decade earlier, and David has spent 6 months trying to find a romantic partner through a VHS video dating service called Video Rendezvous with no success. One day while at the service, he finds a tape in a bargain bin called Rent-A-Pal, hosted by a cheerful sweater-wearing man named Andy, played by Will Wheaton. The tape is designed to simulate conversation, pausing for the viewer to respond before Andy reacts. David initially dismisses it, but returns to it the following evening after learning that a woman named Lisa, who had shown interest in him, has already matched with someone else. Alone in the basement with a glass of whiskey and his father's music playing, David begins talking to Andy through the screen. Andy listens, shares stories, asks questions, and David feels heard for the first time in years. The relationship deepens over many sessions. They play cards, swap stories, and Andy gradually fills every space in David's life where connection should be. When Video Rendezvous contacts David again to say Lisa is now available, he pursues her, and they begin spending time together. But the tape has already taken hold. When Lucille accidentally cuts the Rent-A-Pal tape apart, mistaking the film strip for Scotch tape, David strikes her in the face with it and immediately goes to buy a replacement copy. After rewatching it, he carries Lucille to the top of the basement stairs, tells her coldly that she is the reason Frank killed himself, and pushes her down. Every television in the house begins playing Rent-A-Pal simultaneously. Lisa arrives to make amends after an earlier argument and discovers Lucille's body. David confronts her while speaking in Andy's cadence, attempts to kill her, and she stabs him in the chest with a pair of scissors and escapes. David drags himself into the basement, fast-forwards the tape to Andy's farewell, and dies there alone, which is exactly what Andy always wanted. Resolution. Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead's 2012 micro-budget horror opens with graphic designer Michael Danube receiving a mysterious email containing a video of his best friend Chris Daniels, a crystal meth addict who has retreated to a remote squatter's cabin on Native American reservation land in rural Southern California. Against the objections of his pregnant wife Jennifer, Michael drives out, stuns Chris with a taser, and handcuffs him to an exposed plumbing pipe inside the cabin. Michael tells Chris he will stay chained for 7 days without drugs, after which he is going to rehab whether he agrees or not. As the detox days grind forward, Michael begins finding objects that have been deliberately left for him to discover: strange photographs, old vinyl records containing what sounds like someone being attacked, library books replaced by film slides, and a VHS tape found at a nearby gravestone that shows footage of Michael and Chris inside the cabin recorded from angles that no camera could have captured. A local named Charles warns Michael to stop digging. An enigmatic man named Byron speaks to Michael in circular, unsettling terms about stories needing proper endings. When Michael checks the original email again, the video has changed. It now shows an argument between him and Chris that only just happened. Billy and Micah, violent acquaintances of Chris, return to the cabin and kill a dog Chris had adopted. Chris breaks down and admits he is suicidal. The projector Michael recovered from a nearby shed activates on its own and shows funeral photographs of both men. His laptop plays footage of Billy and Micah beating them to death. A CD found in his car plays audio of Charles shooting them and burning down the cabin. Michael refuses to leave for fear of bringing whatever is watching them back to his wife. The two men stay and witness Charles and a companion killing Billy and Micah before setting the cabin on fire exactly as the footage predicted. Chris, shaken and broken, agrees to go to rehab. In that moment, the entity that has been orchestrating everything rises before them. Chris falls to his knees. Michael looks up at it and asks, "Can we try it another way?" Because some stories were never written for the people trapped inside them, and hitting play was never your choice to make. Shudder, Banjong Pisanthanakun, and Park Poom Wongpoom's 2004 Thai supernatural horror begins in Bangkok, where a freelance photographer named Tun and his girlfriend Jane are driving home after a party with friends late at night. Jane strikes a woman on the road. Tun refuses to let her get out of the car to check on the woman, and the two drive away, leaving her behind. When Tun develops his next rolls of film, white shadows and indistinct faces begin appearing in his photographs where none should be. Tun begins experiencing severe neck pain, and a doctor informs him his body weight has doubled for no medical reason. Jane starts researching and identifies the woman they hit as Natra, a shy former classmate of Tun's at college. Tun admits they had a secret relationship that he kept hidden from his friends because she was considered a social outcast. When Tun ended the relationship, Natra threatened to take her own life. Jane discovers Natra has been appearing in photographs inside Tun's apartment, always crawling toward the bookcase. When Jane searches behind it, she finds a set of negatives. She develops them and finds photographs of Tun's college friends sexually assaulting Natra. Confronted, Tun admits he was present during the assault, did not intervene, and photographed it himself on his friend's instruction so it could be used to blackmail Natra into silence. Natra later died by suicide. One by one, Tun's friends from college die by suicide, each one visibly driven to it by the haunting. Tun and Jane locate Nature's mother and find Nature's body still in her bedroom, uncremated because her mother could not let go. They arrange a proper funeral. That night at a hotel, Nature's ghost confronts Tun directly, chasing him until he falls from a fire escape. Back in Bangkok, Jane leaves him. Tun flings his camera across his apartment in rage, and it fires one final photograph as it hits the floor. When Tun picks it up and looks at it, he sees Natra's ghost sitting on his shoulders, and the shock of seeing her causes him to crash through his apartment window. The final scene shows Jane visiting a catatonic Tun in the hospital, slumped and silent. As the door swings shut, the glass reflects Natra still seated on his shoulders. Because some photographs do not just capture the moment, they trap everything you were too cowardly to face. Skinamarink. Kyle Edward Ball's 2022 Canadian experimental horror is set in 1995 and shot entirely in grainy low light inside a house that becomes less of a home and more of a trap with every passing minute. 4-year-old Kevin falls down the stairs in what his 6-year-old sister Kaylee attributes to sleepwalking. Their father brings him home from the hospital. Then, without explanation, their father disappears. The windows and doors of the house are gone. No exits remain. Kevin and Kaylee drag blankets and pillows to the living room, pile their toys around them on the floor, and turn on the television, which plays VHS cartoons on a continuous loop throughout the entire film. Furniture begins appearing on the ceiling. Objects float against the walls. A voice speaks to Kaylee from the darkened hallway, calling her upstairs. She follows it into her parents' bedroom, where she sees apparitions of her father and then her mother, both of whom vanish. The voice calls again. This time Kaylee refuses and asks for her parents instead. The voice instructs Kevin to take her to the basement. When his flashlight cuts out and then reignites in the dark, it illuminates Kaylee standing in front of him, her eyes and mouth gone, replaced entirely by smooth skin. The entity later tells Kevin, "Kaylee didn't do as she was told. She said she wanted her mom and dad, so I took her mouth away." Kaylee disappears from the house entirely. Kevin is left alone with the voice. It commands him to go to the kitchen and insert a knife into his eye. He does. Screaming fills every room. Kevin calls 911 and tells the operator he is hurt and the doors are gone. The phone transforms into a plastic toy chatter telephone, and the entity tells him it can do anything. The screen cuts to a title card reading 572 days. Kevin is seen walking through corridors that open into a seemingly infinite hallway. A dollhouse sits on a pile of toys in the dark. Blood splatters against a wall and then disappears, splatters and disappears again. Kevin asks Kaylee if they can watch something happy. A blurred, pale face appears above him in bed and tells him to go to sleep. Kevin asks what its name is, twice. It never answers, because in this house, nothing that takes you ever has to explain itself, and hitting play was the moment you walked through a door that no longer exists. And that is the list. If you are choosing where to start, Shudder is the one if you want a ghost story that reframes every moment of guilt you thought you understood. Skinamarink sits at the top because it is the only film here where the horror never explains itself, never shows itself, and never stops. And the darkness just keeps asking you to go to sleep. Drop a comment. Which film disturbed you the most? Hit like and subscribe. More horror breakdowns coming soon.